We are back, and we are joined by Katelyn Burns, freelance journalist, columnist for Xtra and MSNBC. She was the first openly transgender Capitol Hill reporter in U.S. history. Katelyn, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
So, as somebody who has covered politics on Capitol Hill, can you describe what the first less than month of the Trump administration has been like in its aggressive attack on trans rights?
It's not been great. It's certainly not a great time to be a trans person in the U.S. right now. I think of most concern for most trans people is the situation with our passports. We don't really have a lot of answers right now as to whether we can even renew passports. It seems completely dependent on sort of what you had on your passport before and what the government feels like you should have now. And there are some unconfirmed reports, I want to say, of trans people actually having their passports confiscated just before foreign travel, which are concerning. But beyond that, I mean, the executive order on gender-affirming care for minors essentially backdoors a national ban on gender-affirming care for kids. And you're starting to see hospitals just completely capitulate, even in bright blue areas like New York or LA. So I think those two are the most concerning at this point.
Let's start tackle the first piece about the passports. I can say this as somebody who has a trans man in my life, sent in their passport right after Trump's election to try to get a renewal. Hasn't heard anything, can't get through, can't get it back. And he's hearing from other people that that's the same experience. And basically, there's no answers here. Like, my question was, well, can you at least get the old document back? Because there's going to be still some time left and before it expires potentially. But it seems like they're just not sending them back when people tried to renew.
Yeah, this is part of the confusion that is happening right now is we don't know the answer. And I have personal friends who are trans, obviously a lot of them, as you may suspect. And even myself, my passport expires in 2 years. I don't know what the situation is going to be when I go to renew it. And people come to me because I'm supposed to be a source of answers, especially on the political side of things. Like, what's going on with the passport thing? I'm like, I don't, like, nobody knows. Nobody has any answers. They haven't really released a guideline. I think there was some tenuous guidelines that were leaked early last week that had to do with X marked passports, like the third gender marking. And there hasn't been really anything for. My worry is I changed my gender marker on my passport to F in 2017. But before that, when I was 17 years old, I had a passport for a school trip to France that was a male marked passport. So we're hearing reports now that they have records of your past passports and they're going back and checking everybody who renews for that gender marker. So my concern is if I go today to renew my passport that expires in 2 years, they're just going to take my passport away completely, and now I can't leave the country. And that is certainly very concerning given just the avalanche of hate that the conservative side of this country has been launching at trans people for the last decade.
And outside of the travel piece, can you explain the practical implications of trans folks not having a current government document that accurately identifies their gender?
Yeah, so ever since Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State allowed trans people to change their gender marker without getting bottom surgery, this has been the only way for red state trans people to have an official government ID that shows, their transition gender, if you will, their true gender identity. It was a way to bypass the state process of, well, my state doesn't allow me to change my gender on my driver's license or on my birth certificate, but at least now with a passport, I have something. So if you go to apply for a job, you have to present either one primary documentation of your ID that shows you're eligible to work in the United States or two minor documents. So most people just show their birth certificate and their driver's license, and that's two minor forms of documentation. But for a trans person in a red state that can't change those, they're now immediately outing themselves to their employer. And that has actually been a vector for kind of rampant discrimination in the past. And the great thing about the passport is that is a primary documentation of your identity. So you can just hand your passport to your employer that has the correct gender marker, and you're not outing yourself as a trans person to a potentially hostile work environment. So losing this outside of the travel component is also very devastating.
What there, I'd imagine, hopefully, the beginnings of some organization around solidarity on this issue. Is there a with trans people at the very least? But is there discussion about how potentially like a labor union could protect from some of this discrimination, or is this basically just because the Trump administration is opening up the doors, there's not going to be any enforcement?
Yeah, so historically, labor unions have been a really good layer of protection for trans workers, especially on the healthcare front. When labor unions are negotiating contracts, one very easy thing they can do is just write it in as a requirement in the contract that the company has to cover gender-affirming care. And we've seen that historically. That's part of sort of the wave of access that has come about within trans care since, I would say, 2014 or so. But on the ID front, I don't think that there's much that unions can really do, other than maybe building into their contract a non-discrimination clause. But even then, it's not going to prevent like widespread discrimination. Most of this country still, unfortunately, is not unionized workplaces. So anybody not working in a union shop would still be subject to potential discrimination, even though it's technically illegal right now, according to the Supreme Court.
Although, of course, we know that that is a fluid situation given its extremist far-right orientation. You mentioned the way that the hospitals are responding to the Trump administration. I know there were protests here in New York City outside of NYU. Langone, I believe, was the hospital.
Yep.
And more escalation, more protests are escalating and cropping up across the country. What can you tell us about where that stands at the moment?
Yeah, I don't know what to say about NYU Langone. I don't live in New York City, although I have a lot of friends who are there. I do know that one of their higher ups in the decision-making chain is quite conservative, so I was not shocked to learn that they would jump on this bandwagon quickly. I'll also note that I believe that there's going to be a contract negotiation between some nurses in Brooklyn and NYU Langone that sort of intersects with this. I know that there were some of them at the trans protests as well. So this might be a moment for some solidarity between the union movement in this country and trans people. But I will say in other places in the country, around the country, hospital systems are responding to these protests. There have been several who have announced that they were canceling, or they very quietly were starting to cancel appointments for trans youth. And then they saw these massive protests outside their doors, and now they're switching course. And you're also seeing pressure from blue state attorney generals. I mean, in New York, it's illegal to discriminate in healthcare decisions against trans people. So I believe Letitia James came out and said, if you don't provide this care, it's a violation of state law. So there's still like layers of protection there for folks that I think are going to end up being settled in the courts. And that makes me very, very nervous.
Right. And there's just so many different fronts here, right? Like you wrote a piece in Extra about the effects of Trump's actions on the search for missing trans kids.
Yeah.
You know, we know that unhoused and homeless youth and just people, disproportionately LGBTQ people are represented. But can you explain more about the effects on those search efforts based on Trump's actions of just like blowing up the federal government and Doge or whatever the hell?
Yeah, so the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children operates basically from a Department of Justice grant. And they heard this week from the DOJ that funding would be threatened if they didn't strip all references to trans kids from their website. And also, when they put out reports on specific missing children, if they happen to be trans, they have to use the child's dead name and birth sex, basically. So the piece that I wrote is, how the heck are you supposed to find a missing trans kid if you're looking for somebody who doesn't use that name that you're searching for them under and doesn't even present as the sex that you're saying that they were, and you also can't note that they were trans? This is where Trump's executive orders, they're attempting to define a reality without trans people, but trans people still exist within our reality. Just because the president doesn't believe that trans people exist doesn't mean that there isn't a missing trans kid out there. And you can't just rule by fiat that trans people are invalid and
I would
don't
imagine
exist.
trans kids are also subjected to human trafficking, which is all I hear from the right. If we're looking for missing children, that a child can still be trans and be sexually exploited.
Yes.
But I mean, their reaction to that would be, who cares, basically?
Yeah, it's quite disgusting.
Yeah.
The way they look at it. And then if there is a trans kid who is sexually exploited from an early age, they will say, oh, well, that's why they're trans.
Right.
And that's the sort of second very insidious part that goes along with this.
Same playbook with gay kids as well was, we love them, but they're victims. So we have to just basically show them tough love. But this element of erasure is also specifically pronounced with trans people. And you also wrote a piece for your Patreon that was very critical of the New York Times, which, sometimes media criticism we've talked about, can be a little bit of a lazy thing when we engage in it, because it's more like, let's just talk about the politics of it. But the New York Times over the past 4 years on two incredibly important issues has been actively misleading folks. I would say on the genocide in Gaza and on the issue of trans rights, where they put out endless op-eds and endless articles essentially questioning trans identity and portraying it as a bit of a trend. And now that Trump gets back into office, the editorial board has the gall to come out and talk about protecting trans people. If you could just explain the context of why people are outraged and about the Times doing this about face right now.
I'm glad you're letting me talk about this, because I am an OG New York Times hater.
Solidarity, yes.
So basically, they came up with this op-ed, and it was mostly about the trans military ban that Trump has reinstated, which is a very unpopular policy that he had in his first term. I covered it extensively back then. But I was reading it, and I don't typically read them, but this one I made an exception for, and I just got so mad, because they're talking about these executive orders and how cruel they are. And they're going through the impacts on trans people. They're talking about trans kids, trans athletes, the passport thing. And I'm like, each one of these things has been addressed either by both your news and opinion sections or by your opinion section. You employ multiple opinion writers who just flat out deny that trans people exist. I don't know if you want me to name them, but I'm happy to.
Go ahead. I mean, one of them is out now, right? Pamela Paul.
Paul, yeah.
We still have some stragglers.
She was the polite liberal transphobe on the staff, but you had David French, who has a long history, even before writing for the Times, of just demonizing trans people in, the most polite, conservative way. Ross Douthat is, I think my first draft called him a conservative Catholic cuck, which I'm allowed to say because I am also a Catholic cuck. So,
Very nice.
It's not just the opinion side either. They have several reporters who just, it feels like they have an agenda.
Right. And can you explain why that is? It's always like we're pursuing this truth. There must be something here where we can portray both sides. But by asking some of these questions repeatedly and with the emphasis they do, they call into question kind of just like basic facts about trans identity. And it's this paternalism that bothers me of we know better as New York Times reporters than the very people who are saying this is my reality. Well, like that if you could just explain what that's like and
yeah.
I
mean, I always start this off by saying that gender-affirming care for youth is probably the most prominent one that they go long on all the time, and the treatment that they're attacking has been endorsed by every major American medical association in existence. It's endorsed by numerous international boards. The French government just came out basically and said the affirming approach is the correct one. So you have this laundry list of just the biggest medical experts in the world basically saying this is the right treatment. And then you have like a handful of crank doctors on the other side saying, well, no, we think there's an issue with it. And the New York Times gives both of them equal weight, or sometimes gives the crank doctors even more weight. It reminds me a lot of the climate change debate, which they, I think, pretty much did the same thing. But I'll say this about the New York Times. I think that they, more than any other news organization, did more to take transphobia from a fringe right-wing position to making it this hotly contested political issue that we have now.
By bringing it into polite liberal discourse, essentially, right?
Correct, yeah.
And I would say hyping up hysteria in communities like wealthier suburban communities that about this being some sort of thing they'd have to worry about with their child, that it's spreading like almost like they portray it as it's an infection or something like that, right? And it's crazy because in 2022 we saw the Republicans try to run on transphobia, and they did not do well in that election cycle. But it's hard for me to assess if it's just like kind of Trump and his force of personality, or if it's what you described, this like normalization of transphobia by these elite media institutions, or it's probably both.
Yeah, I do think that the trans athlete issue, more than any other, is the most difficult for the left to counter. I've written about that issue more than probably any of the others in my career, but that's also because I have a degree in sport management. I was an athlete growing up myself. I have an inherent interest in it. People forget I also have two cisgender daughters. So I can see all sides of this issue, and my focus has always been on the science. And I don't think people have a grasp on the science of trans athletes. I'm not going to sit here and recite it back to you now because it would take too long. But I wish that science would lead on the trans athlete debate instead of this gut feeling, quote unquote, common sense that we get from conservatives and a lot of quote unquote conservative liberals.
Well, I mean, it's a gut feeling because it's just this old adage about protecting little white girls that you'll see across, you'll see in historical portrayals of Indigenous Americans, of Black Americans and their threat to white women. I mean, like what's her name? The fifth place idiot swimmer,
Riley
Gaines. Like that's what she's invoking. And that when people say that's their gut reaction, it's like, have you ever seen, especially prepubescent kids playing sports?
Yeah.
Like there's nothing you need to worry about. And if these trans girls get their gender affirming care in the way that they need, none of this is going to be an issue. It wouldn't even be an issue without that, but it's solved just by trans care immediately. But then those same folks are disinterested and skeptical of trans care.
Right. It's really interesting that when they're making a medical argument, it's this like horribly irreversible, permanent, drastic change. But when it comes to trans athletes, trans care doesn't do anything, actually.
Yeah.
They're talking out of both sides of their mouths. And I mean, I've seen my own athletic performance. It dipped dramatically. I was a runner when I transitioned, although I haven't been able to run since getting COVID. And my times took an immediate dip when I started estrogen. That's unscientific. Like, there wasn't anybody studying the before and the after. It was just my anecdotal report. But every trans person I know that was an athlete before will tell you this. So to us, it's common sense. To everybody else, it's like, these men who think that they are physically superior to all women. It's the same people who think that if they played Serena Williams in a tennis match that they could win a point off of her. And it's like, no, you're not going to.
Right.
You just overestimate your own abilities. It's like the guys who think that they can wrestle a bear and win. It's like, no, you would die.
And as we wrap up, Katelyn, I guess that part of it is really, I think, important for people to just think about. The over focus in particular on trans women versus trans men. Can you talk a little bit about what conservatives, why they're fixated particularly on trans women? I have my own theories, but what's your assessment?
I think it's
girls, I should say, trans women and girls. Yeah.
I think that it's easy to demonize the appearance of a trans woman, especially somebody like me who transitioned a little older, and maybe doesn't pass as well. I think it's easy to portray us as this grotesque other, when in actuality we're your next door neighbor. We're the best player in your video game lobby. Sorry, it's true. We use your grocery store. That I could go into everything. We are your neighbors. But it's very easy in an online setting to go, they could take my worst selfie, and believe me, I've taken bad ones. Who hasn't? And say, look at this person. You believe that as a woman? And it's very, very easy to radicalize folks. And I think that's why there's so much focus on trans women. And the thought that I'll leave you with is this. The arguments for trans rights, in other words, what trans people are asking for from society, haven't changed in 50 years. I found a speech the other day from like the 1974 St. Christopher Street rally of a famous trans woman. I apologize. Her name escapes me off the top of my head. It's the "Y'all better quiet down" speech. If you're LGBT, you probably have heard of that. But she's talking about trans people in prisons. She's talking about how gay and trans people can't find housing. Gay and trans people can't find work. And those are the same issues that we've been asking for, the same rights that we've been asking for the last 50 years. So there's this sense on the right that I think pervaded quote unquote normie society that, trans rights went too far. And my counter is I think you all became way more obsessed with us because what we're asking for hasn't changed in all of that time. I think that you all just needed somebody else to focus on once gay marriage became the law of the land.
Yep. Senate Twink, great name, writes in Sylvia Rivera.
That's the one. Thank you. Sorry.
There you go.
Truly embarrassing. I couldn't remember that.
Yeah, well, our audience is very smart and on top of it, and I always love to kiss their ass as well. So, thanks so much, Katelyn. Really appreciate your time today. Where can people support your work? I know you have a Patreon and you write some other places as well.
Yeah, so I have a laundry list of side gigs, I like to say. So patreon.com/Katelyn Burns. I'm also co-founder of the FlyTrap, which is an independent feminist media newsletter. And lastly, I am co-host of the Cancel Me Daddy podcast, where we make fun of all the people who complain about cancel culture.
Oh, fun. I think I'm going to be tuning in for catharsis on that front. We'll put a link to all that below wherever people are listening to or watching this. Thanks so much, Katelyn. Really appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.